All right, dozens of leaked classified documents from the Pentagon reveal the U.S. is spying on its allies and Russia. NBC News obtained more than 50 of the documents, many of them which are labeled top secret. They are dated from February to March and refer to information collected by several U.S. intelligence agencies on countries such as Israel and South Korea. There is also tactical information about the war in Ukraine. The documents first appeared online last month. Both the Justice Department and Pentagon say they are investigating the leak. Officials believe the documents are most likely authentic, though some may have been doctored.
Let's bring in right now retired CIA officer Mark Polymeropoulos. He's an NBC News security and intelligence analyst. Also, the Washington Post David Ignatius still with us as well. Mark, okay, let's pretend you're at a CIA briefing. You have 30 seconds to explain to your superiors what the hell's going on here. What the hell's going on here?
So I think it's a potentially serious compromise. We don't know yet. Key points are we have to catch the traitor. Number two, kind of reestablish or reassure our allies, our bilateral relationships. And number three is conduct a damage assessment. Particularly on what looks like a compromise of signals intelligence. So I would say this is not end of days, possibly serious. Time will tell.
What are you most concerned about?
The biggest concern by far is the compromise of signals intelligence collection. So on a good note, there's nothing in there about human intelligence. This has nothing to do with our agents, our spies on the ground. No loss of life would likely occur. But this has to do with collection streams on Russia, which are quite important. Now, I think that there's going to be a damage assessment that is done. I'm not all that concerned about the effects, the tactical effects on the battlefield. But ultimately, it's kind of long term. The future signals intelligence capabilities of the United States. That's something that's going to be looked at very carefully.
So let me ask you this: since we didn't reveal human intelligence or compromise anybody that way, I'm curious. There seemed to be a lot of embarrassing information regarding the Russians in here. Is it possible that maybe this was a psyops operation where we released information to get in the Russians' head?
Well, I suppose anything's possible. And of course, that's what on the Russian Telegram, the military channels, which a lot of us follow, they actually believe that's exactly what happened. I'm not so sure that's exactly what occurred. But ultimately, there's a lot of confusion. There's so many questions behind this. But there's one key point, Joe, that I think has to be made. There's some documents in there, or at least the reports I've read in the press, which do seem a little odd to me. The notion that Mossad senior officials were fomenting some of the protests, fomenting some of the unrest in Israel. That doesn't make much sense. That looks like a garble. So there's really a lot of questions that the documents themselves raise. And so I think a lot of people are skeptical, but there'll be a damage assessment. We'll see.
So David, break it down for us. What's your take on the document leaks?
So, Joe, I'm struck by the fact that intelligence, which had been our strongest weapon in the first year of the war, we were able to backfoot the Russians time and again by releasing intelligence information, suddenly is an Achilles heel for us. These revelations are embarrassing. Suddenly we're on the defensive. The U.S. is worrying about how could they have been leaked. Second point, agreeing with everything that Mark said about the problems for sources and methods and collection of intelligence. If you look at the substance and assume that it's more or less accurate, these documents describe a real crisis ahead for Ukraine in terms of its ability to maintain adequate air defense. They talk about running out of specific air defense missiles by the end of April, by early May. And there has been a great difficulty in finding these weapons around the world to resupply Ukraine. So, again, in terms of substance, I think the biggest takeaway for me is a sense that, at least in the air defense sector, Ukraine is near exhaustion, and the U.S. has to pay much more attention to supplying them.
So to Ukraine now, new reporting this weekend in the New York Times highlights the story of a group of Ukrainian mothers who ventured 3,000 miles to retrieve 16 children forcibly taken to Russian-occupied territory in the east and Crimea. Traveling first through Poland, Belarus, and even Russia, the mothers were able to successfully bring their kids back, some of whom were their own sons. Since the war began, the Ukrainian government reports over 16,000 children have been taken into Russia and territory it controls, describing the actions as war crimes. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant last month for Russian President Vladimir Putin related to the issues surrounding the displacement and relocation of Ukrainian children. And David, if you could talk a little bit more about the children that are being basically abducted and what they're doing with them, but also the Ukrainian women, Ukrainians in general. You don't mess with them. These mothers just marched into Russia and got their kids back, a small number, but a much larger problem.
I mean, Mika, think of the horror of this, of children being kidnapped and taken across national borders. This is the kind of thing that happened in the Soviet Union under Stalin. The Crimea, a territory that Ukraine desperately wants back. Crimea was depopulated from the people who lived there, who were just shipped willy-nilly out to Uzbekistan because Stalin decided that it was better to have ethnic Russians there than the native Crimean Tatars. This is the kind of thing that happened in the worst times of the 20th century, and it's back. And it's a scandal that Putin is conducting these things. People should see them for what they are. They're war crimes, and he needs to be held to account.
Mark Polymeropoulos, this is straight out of Stalin's playbook, the worst of Joseph Stalin. And of course, it begs the question: if there is a peace deal that keeps Vladimir Putin in place in Russia, the question is how does Ukraine move forward? How does the West move forward with somebody who's adopted some of Stalin's worst tactics?
Joe, that's right, and I think that there's a lot of thinking in the administration on what happens when the war ends, and it eventually will end. I think there is certainly going to be concern that Europe is actually going to rush back into the arms. At least some countries might rush back to try to normalize relations with Russia. But I think these stories are really important to highlight. I think the notion of holding Vladimir Putin accountable for war crimes is really important because we can't, at the end of the day, let this stand. Now, a lot of people wonder, will Putin ever be brought to justice? At this point, it doesn't matter. What is key is documenting these abuses. It is absolutely critical that Russia, for them to reintegrate into the international community. At some point, maybe they will decide that Putin has to go. But this is a war criminal, one of the great tyrants of our time, and so documenting these war crimes is absolutely something that's going to be first on the mind of clearly of the administration, but of our European partners as well.
Yep. Growing NATO. Retired CIA analyst Mark Polymeropoulos and the Washington Post David Ignatius. Thank you both very much for coming on this morning.